What's up, Human Phys class? This is section 9.2, Anatomy of the Human Heart. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about the circulatory system, pulmonary versus systemic, arteries, veins, and capillaries. And what we're going to focus on in this section is the heart. We're spending a lot of time on section 9.2. After this video tomorrow, you will be basically identifying all the anatomical features of the heart, looking at how the flow of blood moves through the heart, and then we will be doing a sheep heart dissection so you can really look at the anatomy. So let's get started. So by the end of this unit, you should locate the cavities that encase the heart, identify the layers of the walls of the heart, locate the anatomical structures of the heart, including the valves, and know the path of blood through it. That should be our main focus. All right, so first thing we're going to look at is the fact that your heart is just not free-floating inside of your chest. Like a majority of our internal organs, it's surrounded by what we classify as a pericardial cavity. Okay, and that cavity, as you can see here, basically encompasses the heart, much like if you were to take a fist and put it into a balloon. Okay, so the heart is the size of a fist. You know, if we get some, like we talked about in our last video, the lining of this cavity is a serose membrane, which is very fluid-like, very stretchy. It's made of connective tissue and epitheliums, and we classify that as the pericardium. Para, if you remember, means around. Cardium speaks to the heart. Okay, so again, if you can visualize this image, maybe you have a picture down, but just understand that this pericardial cavity surrounds the heart as kind of like a protective layer, almost like an airbag around the heart. It will obviously move because when the heart contracts, it gets smaller. When it releases its blood and expands, it should get bigger. So it has the ability to move a little bit. So the pericardium, however, can be subdivided into the visceral and the parietal pericardium. Now, to me, when I think of visceral, I think of internal, like our visceral organs are inside. And what do you know? Your visceral pericardium is kind of this inside layer. Okay, so red is heart, all right? And you may want to draw this down. Yellow is visceral, okay? On this white portion here, this is what we classify as the actual pericardial cavity. In addition to that, we also have some pericardial fluid, and this fluid basically eliminates friction during the heart contractions. It's going to be between the parietal and the visceral locations. I don't really have it labeled on this image, but the main thing you need to know is that there's fluid there, and as the heart contracts and as the heart expands, that fluid is much going to help. Very similar to cerebral spinal fluid, which is in between the brain and the spinal cord. All right, the heart itself is a muscle, all right, and it is made of a variety of layers. And notice that if we really look back to our root words, our prefixes, we'll know that epi means on top. So our first one is the epicardium, which is found here, all right? I know it doesn't say epicardium, it says parietal pericardium, but epicardium is on the outside. And that is the outer layer. And this is where we're beyond the cavity, or we're inside of the cavity now. So this would be kind of basically touching up against, the visceral pericardium. So this is endo, this is myo, and then this white band right here, which is tough to see. I'm going over with my cursor. That would be your epicardium, and that's the outer layer. So then this is going to be basically in contact with that visceral pericardium. And I know I see here it's labeled the visceral pericardium right where I'm pointing, but it's epicardium basically is speaking to the outer layer. In the middle, we have the myocardium. So myo, middle, that's mostly cardiac muscle, which does have some striations, and it's kind of like a mesh, almost like a screen door. If you look at the screening or a screening in a window, that's kind of how cardiac muscle is laid out. Because what you want to do is when electrical signal moves, you want to be able to send it over all of the muscles. By doing that, you're connecting and it makes a nice even muscle contraction. Because like if you want the ventral contract, you want that whole area to contract. Last but not least, we have the endocardium. That is the thin inner lining within the chambers of the heart. So this actually comes in contact with blood. All right, so this would be the inside portion of, let's say, the ventricle, left or right, or the atrium. So this endocardium serves as a means to contain all of that blood. Now, the heart needs to feed itself. So when looking and talking about the outer portions of the heart, we actually have arteries that will run over it. Okay, these will be tough to see on the sheep heart, but please look for them. I'll have you look for them on Friday. But when looking at it, these are classified as the coronary. Now, I'm not going to have you know that this is the left main, this is the circumflex, anterior, right coronary. I just want you to know that there are arteries on top of the heart, and every time the blood pumps out, most notably out of the aorta, if you're looking right where I'm pointing, this is the pulmonary artery going to the lungs. This is the aorta, and actually snakes around behind here. But notice right out of there, some of the very first blood that exits the heart that's oxygenated is going to tap out of that aorta and then fill these coronary arteries and feed the heart. So let's get into the anatomy here a little bit. First and foremost, the heart has 4 chambers. Okay, we have 2 atria, and they're also called atrium, and they are going to be filling up these areas on top here. Getting the map again, as you can see, this is the right atrium, this is the left atrium anatomically, and these are very thin. Okay, they're upper chambers, they receive blood returning to the heart through veins. So, right atrium is going to receive blood from the superior vena cava, which is that major vein coming back, and it's also going to receive blood from the inferior vena cava. These are 2 major blood vessels, veins, that have deoxygenated blood. Superior is obviously going to come from the head and the arms. Inferior is going to come from the internal organs as well as the legs. So the ventricles, however, are much thicker. If you look right here, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle. Their space is a little bit bigger as well. They receive blood from the atria above and then pump blood out through the arteries. So let's take a look at the right ventricle. It's received deoxygenated blood from the superior and inferior vena cava. It is going to go into the right ventricle, and then it's going to come out of the PA, or the pulmonary artery. Notice it splits here, right? Because we're going to go off to one lung, and we're going to go off to the other lung. Now, the left ventricle is separated by something called the septum, which you'll easily be able to see, which is basically a major wall that keeps all that deoxygenated blood over here and all that oxygenated blood over here. We don't want that to ever mix. That's a real problem. But this left ventricle is going to be much bigger because it's going to be pumping out through the aorta, which has a lot of blood, a lot more pressure. It is the biggest blood vessel and has the strongest walls because there's a lot of pressure coming out of there. So let's talk about that a little bit. When I mentioned on the last slide that the left ventricle has very thick muscular walls, as you can see here, here's the right ventricle, very thin. Why is that? That's the question that we ask. Well, first and foremost is blood pressure. That's to be the first thing. Blood pressure is one of the major things that you're going to want to think about, because with pressure, you got to have some strength in there. The other thing is that this is responsible for pumping blood through the systemic circuit. Okay, systemic circuit. So when we think about just how big this is, it's got to pump blood up to the head, all the way back down here to the legs, and up to the internal organs. I'll put IO for that. So essentially, it needs to contain the largest amount of pressure to make sure that we are pumping that blood to those longer locations. Now, an example of where this can start to fail is if you have really, really long arms, you tend to have, or long legs, or you're really tall and skinny, you tend to have bad circulation. That's because this heart is trying to pump blood all the way to those locations with one pump. It's pretty difficult to do. So, next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit on the valves. So we have valves, and valves are essentially responsible for one-way flow. Okay, so when we talked about the veins, okay, we talked about here's a vein. We have this, essentially these doors, okay? So if blood is going that way, if it tries to go back that way, it can't, okay? So veins allow for one-way flow, but so do valves, okay? We have 4 total. We have 2 atrioventricular, okay? And if you think about it, atrioventricular is speaking to a valve between the atria and the ventricle, okay? So we also have some semilunar valves. So the left atrioventricular valve actually has a couple names, okay? So if we look right here, this would be the left AV, okay, that I'm kind of highlighting right here. Now, for this class, you can call it the left AV. For any of you that are going into any medical fields, you'll note that this could also be called a bicuspid or mitral valve. Bicuspid, as you can see, it kind of has 1-2 flaps there. The right atrioventricular valve, also called the right AV valve, is called a tricuspid because it actually has 3 flaps, 1, 2, 3. That's one thing that I really want you guys to try and find when we start opening up the heart a little bit, is see if you can see the tricuspid versus the bicuspid. Now again, notice that this right AV valve is a little bit bigger than the left AV valve, okay? So note that, you know, especially when we're looking at what that valve is responsible for doing. So, we've talked about the AV valves. Now, below that, or excuse me, not below that, technically above that, we're going to have the aortic semilunar valve, which is between the left ventricle and the aorta, and the pulmonary semilunar valve, or you could just call it the pulmonary valve. You could also call that the aortic valve if you choose, but that one is between the left ventricle and the aorta. And these are basically responsible for letting blood into those arteries that will then, this one will then go to the lungs. You know, that's kind of the major thing, and then this one is obviously going to go systemically to make up our blood to all of our body. So these valves, again, are one-way valves, and they just kind of help maintain that pressure. All right, so taking a look here, this is a little bit different image, but I'm just going to go through all 4 of these valves and kind of give you, you've seen kind of a top-down view, but let's take a look at a side view. This would be a sagittal cut, looking at half of it. First one on the left side here is our mitral valve, okay, aka the left AV. So I'm going to write that down just because I'll just put LAV. That's your mitral valve, and that's located right in this location here. Okay, so this is your left atrium, this is your left ventricle. Next one is the tricuspid, aka the right AV valve, and that is located right here, and that is a valve that is going to allow blood to enter into the left ventricle. From there, we have the aortic and the pulmonary. Aortic is right here. Okay, so it is, here's your aorta, and the valve is actually sitting right here if you look where my cursor is, and blood is going to exit the left ventricle, go up through that valve, and then out the aorta. The pulmonary, which is the other semilunar valve, is located right here, and that is going to bring blood out into the pulmonary arteries, which will bring it to the lungs. So just to get that information down and to understand how this flow works, we're going to start here with the pulmonary arteries. Once you leave the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries are going to bring blood to both lungs, as you can see here. And note that that is deoxygenated blood. This blood essentially came from the superior vena cava, or the inferior vena cava, which is above and below the heart, and that is bringing all that deoxygenated blood. And where is it headed? Right to the lungs. So that's where the pulmonary veins come in, and that's kind of this orangish color here. You'll note that we go to the lungs with one artery, we return with 2 veins, okay? And those 2 veins are going to come together into one and empty right into this location that I'm highlighting right here, which is going to bring oxygenated blood back to the heart into the left atrium. Now, once it leaves the left atrium, it's going to go through that mitral valve and enter the left ventricle. From there, it's going to go through the aortic valve and then out and deliver oxygenated blood to the body. So this whole process, the flow of blood, where it's coming from, where it's going, what are the parts that it's going through, is going to be majorly important to understand. And we will definitely be doing a lot of review on this. So take a moment, see if you can name these valves. You know, if we look at number 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, and then 5 is not a valve. But see if you can identify all of these right now based off of where we're pointing. Okay, so something in between the atrium and the ventricle would be 2. Leaving the right ventricle, going into the pulmonary circuit would be right there for 1. 3 would be entering the left ventricle. 4 would be leaving the left ventricle. So I'm going to pause this here, and you can see if you got it on the next slide. Well, hopefully you figured this out, that number 1 here is the pulmonary valve. 2 is the tricuspid, aka the right AV. 3 is the mitral, aka the left AV. And then 4 is your aortic valve. 5 is speaking of something called the heart apex, which is basically the point that it comes to. Not vitally important, but something to note. It basically is at the bottom of the septum here. All right, last but not least, I just kind of have a little picture looking from the top down just so you can see again how all those valves look. 1 right here is speaking to the pulmonary valve, 2 the aortic, 3 the tricuspid, and 4 the bicuspid. This is hopefully a view that you'll get to see when we're done dissecting. You'll be able to see how all these valves work. These are very strong. And you'll note in some of the homework assignments we're going to do what's connected to them. There's a lot of tendons and ligaments involved in that. So that wraps up our section on the heart. Your next focus is going to be the Path of Blood worksheet and looking at homework assignment 9.2. Both of those are going to highlight the major concepts we need to know in this section. As always, if you have questions, please let me know, and we'll hopefully be able to do a little review tomorrow. Have a great day. Yago out.